The 25th of January, 1947, Palm Island, Florida, 93 Palm Avenue. The man in the bed was 48 years old, but he looked like a ghost. 160 pounds of sagging, ruined flesh. His mind was entirely gone. Syphilis had eaten holes through his brain the way termites eat through a house frame. He couldn't remember his own brother's name. He couldn't even finish a sentence. 4 days earlier, he had suffered a stroke, then pneumonia, then heart failure. And just after 7:25 p.m., with his wife May holding one hand and a rosary in the other, Alphonse Gabriel Capone stopped breathing. The most feared gangster in American history died in silk pajamas, in a bed, in a house with a swimming pool. No bullet, no street ambush, no federal noose. Just a body that finally quit on a brain that had quit years earlier. You have to understand what that actually means. Because the Al Capone who died that night was not the Capone the world remembered. And the Capone the world remembered was definitely not the screaming, operatic lunatic swinging a baseball bat at a banquet table that movies like The Untouchables gave you. That is Hollywood. That is Robert De Niro. The real Capone was something else entirely. He was a ruthless tactician, a politician in a $500 suit who understood something no gangster before him had ever quite grasped. He realized that in 1920s Chicago, the difference between a street criminal and a king was not violence. Violence was cheap. The difference was infrastructure. And the man who finally destroyed his empire did not do it with a shotgun. He did it with a ledger. The myth wants you to imagine some old-world Sicilian bandit stepping off a boat with a stiletto in his boot. But the truth is that Al Capone was as American as apple pie and appendicitis. He was born on the 17th of January, 1899, in a cramped walk-up apartment at 95 Navy Street in Brooklyn, New York. His father, Gabriella, was a barber from near Naples, and his mother, Teresa, worked as a seamstress. There were 9 children packed into that family, and Al was the 4th. By all accounts, he was a genuinely smart kid, but he was fiercely proud and cursed with a volatile temper. When a teacher struck him in the classroom at 14 years old, Al struck her right back and got himself expelled. That single violent reaction marked the absolute end of his formal education. He never made it past the 6th grade. From that day forward, the brutal streets of Brooklyn became his classroom. And in 1913, the streets of Brooklyn had real teachers. Capone fell under the wing of men who were currently writing the blueprints for organized crime. Johnny Torrio had come up through Manhattan's 5 Points gang and had deep operations in Brooklyn. Frankie Yale was running the notorious Harvard Inn out on Coney Island. Even a young, wildly ambitious hoodlum named Lucky Luciano was moving up that exact same ladder. Capone started at the absolute bottom. He worked errands. He ran messages. But most importantly, he watched. By around 1917, Capone was working as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn when his temper finally cost him. A small-time hoodlum named Frank Galluccio took deep offense at a remark Al made to his sister. Galluccio did not argue. He pulled a knife and slashed Capone 3 separate times across the left side of his face. Those 3 deep cuts healed into heavy, permanent scars. It was the birth of Scarface. Capone hated the nickname with a burning passion for the rest of his life. He would spin lies to reporters, claiming the brutal wounds came from shrapnel while fighting in the war. He never served a single day in any military branch, but the lie sounded heroic. The truth was just a teenage bouncer getting sliced open for insulting a girl in a dirty dance hall. A year later, in December of 1918, he married May Coughlin. She was an Irish Catholic, blonde, eternally patient, and she would remain married to him until the day he took his final breath. Their only son, Albert Francis, whom they called Sonny, was born that same December, just weeks before the wedding. Sonny would suffer severe hearing loss as a boy. Officially, doctors blamed a mastoid infection, but historians suspect a much darker culprit, congenital syphilis. Al Capone had contracted the disease as a young man working the doors around the brothels. It was treatable, but he reportedly never got the medical care because he was deathly afraid of needles. That single, quiet decision, that one pathetic act of cowardice at 20 years old, set a ticking clock that would eventually destroy his mind and kill him. But that took time, and Capone had a city to conquer first. Around 1920, Johnny Torrio, who had moved out to Chicago to help his relative Big Jim Colosimo run the city's booming vice trade, sent for young Al. Big Jim was an old-school boss, making an absolute fortune off brothels and gambling. But Prohibition was looming, and Big Jim flatly refused to get into the new, highly dangerous booze racket. Torrio looked at the map and saw the future of the American underworld. Big Jim was standing directly in the way. On the 11th of May, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in the vestibule of his own restaurant on South Wabash Avenue. The triggerman was almost certainly Frankie Yale, brought in specifically from New York to do the heavy lifting. The man who orchestrated the hit was Johnny Torrio, and standing right beside him was the young Brooklyn kid Torrio had just imported to be his right hand. Prohibition had gone into effect on January 17 of that year, exactly on Capone's 21st birthday. He didn't see it as a law, he saw it as a divine sign. At just 21 years old, Al Capone stood in the blood-stained streets of Chicago, watching an entire city willingly rearrange itself around a single, massive business opportunity. Most people have absolutely no idea how Prohibition actually worked. The law did not ban drinking. It banned the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol. The massive, insatiable demand did not go anywhere. Tens of millions of Americans still desperately wanted a drink. What Prohibition effectively did was hand a colossal illegal industry over to whoever was ruthless enough to break the law to supply it. Johnny Torrio and Al Capone did not just break the law, they built an industrial machine to exploit it. The infrastructure operated in 4 precise, heavily guarded steps. Step 1 was the source. They bought up industrial alcohol through legitimate-looking front companies, chemically redistilled the poison out, and cut it with water and flavoring. To supply the high-end market, they imported real Canadian whiskey down through Detroit and smuggled it up from the Gulf Coast through Florida. Step 2 was manufacturing. They operated massive, heavily equipped breweries in and around Chicago in plain sight, ensuring silence by paying off local police at hundreds of dollars a month per precinct. Step 3 was distribution. A fleet of heavily armed trucks moved the liquid product from the breweries to distribution warehouses, and then pumped it out to an estimated 10,000 speakeasies scattered across Cook County. Step 4 was protection. Every single link in that sprawling chain, cops, judges, aldermen, sheriffs, and prosecutors got a piece of the action. When they needed political cover, they simply took it. The town of Cicero, just west of Chicago, was essentially annexed by the organization in 1924 when Capone's gunmen brutally strong-armed the election for a puppet mayor. By the late 1920s, federal investigators estimated the gross revenue of the Capone operation at over $100 million a year. That is over $1.5 billion in today's money, and that was from beer and whiskey alone. Add in the brothels pulling in millions more, the gambling parlors generating tens of millions, racetracks skimming, labor racketeering, and the extortion of legitimate businesses. The scale of the empire was staggering, but every single dollar came with a body attached to it. Johnny Torrio was a shrewd boss who vastly preferred business deals to shootouts. He tried to peacefully divide Chicago among the major factions, handing the north side to Dean O'Banion, the near west side to the Gianna brothers, and keeping the south side for himself and Capone. The truce held until it didn't. O'Banion tricked Torrio into a disastrous brewery deal that cost Torrio a fortune, handed him a criminal arrest, and ended with O'Banion publicly taunting him. On the 10th of November, 1924, Dean O'Banion was shot dead in his own flower shop at 738 North State Street. 3 men walked in. One warmly shook his hand, holding it tight, while the other 2 pumped bullets into him. The gunfire was so loud the water in the flower buckets rippled. That single hit ignited the brutal beer wars. O'Banion's crew, now led by Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, demanded blood. On the 24th of January 1925, they caught Johnny Torrio outside his apartment on South Clyde Avenue and shot him repeatedly in the jaw and the abdomen. Torrio should have died on that sidewalk, but he miraculously survived. He spent weeks recovering under heavy armed guard, served a 9-month sentence from that bad brewery raid, and when he got out, he did the unthinkable. He handed the entire operation over to Al Capone and sailed for Italy. At just 26 years old, Al Capone was the undisputed boss of Chicago. This is where Capone fundamentally broke the mold. He understood something Torrio hadn't fully grasped. Fear alone does not sustain an empire. Fear is merely a maintenance tool. What truly sustains an empire is legitimacy. From 1,000 925 onward, Capone launched a PR campaign unlike anything American organized crime had ever seen. He actively courted the press. He gave interviews and posed for photographs. He handed out turkeys to poor families at Thanksgiving. During the Great Depression, he opened a soup kitchen that fed thousands of unemployed men every single day. He sat in a box seat at Wrigley Field and tipped waiters $50 in an era when that covered a month's rent. The mayor of Chicago, William Big Bill Thompson, openly took mob money and gave the outfit the absolute run of the city. The public adored him. When reporters asked about his violent business, Capone famously replied, "I make my money by supplying a public demand. If I break the law, my customers are as guilty as I am." That line landed perfectly because millions of Americans silently agreed with him. But underneath the $500 suits, the diamond stick pins, and the public philanthropy, Al Capone was a stone-cold killer surrounded by a cabinet of executioners. He had Frank Nitti, a quiet, deadly enforcer who handled labor racketeering. He had Jack Machine Gun McGurn, born Vincenzo Ghibaldi, a former boxer in his mid-20s, with ice water in his veins. He had Frank Rio serving as his personal bodyguard, and a ruthless teenager named Tony Accardo climbing the ranks. The war with the Northsiders had never truly stopped. In September of 1926, Jaime Weiss sent a heavily armed convoy of cars past the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, pouring roughly 1,000 rounds of machine gun fire into the building where Capone was eating lunch. Capone survived the storm of lead. 3 weeks later, on the 11th of October 1926, Jaime Weiss was shot dead on the sidewalk near Holy Name Cathedral at just 28 years old. Bugs Moran stepped up to take over the rival crew, utterly unaware that Capone was already plotting a spectacle of violence so horrific it would change American history forever. The morning of the 14th of February 1929 started with cold snow on the Chicago sidewalks and ended with a bloodbath that broke the American public. The address was 2122 North Clark Street, the SMC Cartage Company garage. Inside the unheated, dimly lit brick building, 7 men tied directly to Bugs Moran's Northside crew were shivering and waiting. The bait was simple and irresistible. They had been promised a highly lucrative, hijacked whiskey delivery at a steep underworld discount. It was the perfect trap, meticulously designed by the tactical mind of Capone's top enforcer, Jack Machine Gun McGurn. At exactly 10:30 inches the morning, on Street Valentine's Day, a sleek Cadillac pulled up to the curb. It was meticulously dressed up to look exactly like a Chicago police cruiser. 4 men stepped out into the freezing air. 2 of them were wearing authentic Chicago police uniforms. The other 2 wore heavy civilian overcoats. Moving with absolute authority, they walked straight into the garage. The 7 hardened mobsters inside saw the brass badges and the Navy uniforms. They immediately assumed it was just a routine shakedown or a standard raid. They didn't draw their weapons. Following orders, they obediently lined up against the north wall of the garage, placing their hands flat against the cold bricks. They waited for the frisk. Instead, the 2 men in the civilian overcoats stepped back, reached inside their heavy wool layers, and pulled out Thompson's submachine guns. The uniformed men backed them up with lethal 1-2 gauge shotguns, and then they opened fire. It was an absolute slaughter. Roughly 70 rounds of heavy caliber ammunition, followed by devastating shotgun blasts, ripped through the garage in a matter of seconds. The 7 men against the wall were systematically cut apart, their blood painting the bricks behind them. When real police finally arrived at the smoking scene, they found an abattoir. Astonishingly, one of the victims, Frank Gusenberg, was still breathing. He had 14 bullet wounds carved into his mangled body. A detective knelt in the pooling blood, leaned down to the dying enforcer, and begged him for a name. Gusenberg, honoring the ironclad underworld code with his last ragged breaths, looked up and whispered, "No one shot me." He died 3 agonizing hours later in the hospital without giving up a single name. But the architect of the massacre had missed his primary target. Bugs Moran was supposed to be inside that garage. He was late. As he walked up toward the corner of North Clark Street, he spotted the fake police car idling outside the doors. Spooked, Moran kept walking and slipped away into the snow. He survived the morning, but he knew exactly who had orchestrated the nightmare. When reporters later cornered him and asked who did it, Moran did not hesitate. "Only Capone kills like that," he said. He was right, but proving it was impossible. Al Capone was hundreds of miles away in Miami, Florida, holding a rock-solid, heavily manufactured alibi. He was conveniently meeting with the Dade County solicitor at the exact moment the triggers were pulled. And while Fred Keller Burke was later tied to the murder weapons through early ballistics evidence, the terrifying truth remains. To this day, no one has ever been convicted of the street Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone thought he had won the war. In reality, he had just destroyed his own shield. Something fundamental snapped in the American consciousness after that cold morning. 7 men, shot to pieces against a brick wall in broad daylight, was simply too much even for the deeply cynical citizens of Chicago. The public that had once viewed Capone as a generous, turkey-giving folk hero suddenly saw him for the rabid, untouchable monster he was. The newspapers violently turned on him. The corrupt politicians scrambled to distance themselves. The outrage traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated in March of 1929, found himself relentlessly pressed about the Chicago gangster within his very first weeks in office. Hoover was furious. He reportedly hounded his Treasury Secretary with a single, direct mandate. "Have you got this fellow Capone yet?" The days of dodging local cops and bribing thirsty aldermen were over. From that exact moment on, the full, devastating weight of the federal government was locked onto one man, setting the stage for a downfall that nobody, especially Hollywood, ever saw coming. The jaw-dropping truth of the American justice system is that the federal government did not need to prove Al Capone was a murderer. They just needed to prove he was wealthy. Hollywood sold you the fantasy that a good cop with a fedora and a shotgun brought down the king of Chicago. The legend revolves around Eliot Ness, a 26-year-old Prohibition Bureau agent in 1929. He was ambitious, honest, and highly telegenic. Ness assembled a small squad of incorruptible agents, dubbed the Untouchables, and they put on a spectacular show. They raided breweries, they smashed stills with axes, they confiscated trucks. Between 1,929 and 1,931, the Untouchables cost the Capone organization an estimated $1 million in disrupted operations. But do the math. Capone was grossing over $100 million a year. Losing $1 million to Eliot Ness was not a fatal blow. It was a rounding error. Ness was a nuisance. He made for fantastic newspaper photographs, but he did not break Capone. Not even close. In fact, Ness left Chicago in the early 1930s, eventually becoming the public safety director of Cleveland in 1935. He struggled with alcohol, ran for mayor and lost, and ultimately died in 1957 at 54 years old, entirely broke in a small town in Pennsylvania. He never saw the fame that would explode around him. The book The Untouchables came out months after his death, followed by the television series in 1959 and the blockbuster movie in 1987. It was all built on a career that some of his own contemporaries in law enforcement considered to be mostly showmanship. The man who actually destroyed Al Capone was named Frank J. Wilson. He worked for the intelligence unit of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. He wore glasses, sat quietly at a desk, and absolutely hated cigarette smoke. In 1927, the Supreme Court handed prosecutors a nuclear weapon in United States v. Sullivan, ruling that income generated from illegal activity was still legally taxable. You didn't need to prove Capone bootlegged or killed. You just needed to prove he had income and failed to pay taxes on it. Wilson dug relentlessly for years. He and his team drowned themselves in mountains of bank records, hotel receipts, telegrams, and canceled checks. Finally, they found the smoking gun, a ledger detailing the massive profits of a Cicero gambling operation. It had been sitting untouched among old seized evidence since a 1926 raid. Wilson discovered the organization's bookkeeper, Leslie Shumway, tracked him down all the way to Miami, and convinced him to testify. He found another former Capone cashier named Fred Reese and actually hid him in South America just to keep him alive until the trial. On the 5th of June 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion. The trial began on the 6th of October 1931 inside the federal courthouse in Chicago. Capone's people had already gotten to the jury pool with bribes and threats, but Judge James Wilkerson was tipped off. On the very morning of the trial, in a brilliant tactical maneuver, the judge swapped the entire jury out with another courtroom's panel, Capone's lawyers were left stunned. The trial lasted just 11 days, and the paper trail was overwhelming. Capone had never filed a single tax return in his life, and Wilson had meticulously documented over $1 million in income tied directly to Capone by name. On the 17th of October 1931, the jury found him guilty on 5 counts. Judge Wilkerson hammered the 32-year-old crime boss with the harshest tax evasion sentence in American history up to that point. 11 years in prison, $50,000 in fines, roughly $7,700 in court costs, plus all back taxes owed. In 1932, with his appeals exhausted, Capone entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. But even behind bars, he maintained his grip. He bribed guards, received special treatment, and ran his massive business from his cell through visitors. The government realized Atlanta wasn't tough enough. So in August of 1934, the Bureau of Prisons transferred him to a brand new fortress built specifically to break men exactly like him, Alcatraz. On the Rock, there was no bribery, no newspapers, and no favors. Capone became inmate number 85. He was assigned to work in the prison laundry, and the syphilis he had contracted as a teenager began its final, devastating march through his brain. By 1938, he was showing severe signs of dementia, sitting on his bunk, mumbling to himself, forgetting where he even was. He was formally diagnosed with neurosyphilis. In November of 1939, after serving 7.5 years, shortened only by good behavior credits, Capone was released into hospital care because he was no longer a functioning human being. He retreated to Palm Island, Florida, where his wife May took care of him for 7 more agonizing years. He fished. He played cards with imaginary opponents. His doctors noted that his mental capacity in those final years was that of a 12-year-old child. On the 25th of January, 1947, at the age of 48, he suffered a stroke, then pneumonia, then cardiac arrest, and died. But Capone's true legacy was not violence. It was the indestructible corporate structure he left behind. Frank Nitti took over as the front boss, but the real power smoothly transitioned to Paul Ricca, and later to Tony Accardo, who remained a formidable boss in the outfit until his death in 1992. That is 6 decades of continuous, heavily organized operation, built entirely on the foundation Capone laid before he turned 30. The Chicago outfit went national. They infiltrated Hollywood labor unions. They ran Las Vegas casino skim operations for decades. As for Frank Wilson, the accountant who actually decapitated the empire, he went on to become the chief of the United States Secret Service from 1936 to 1946. He received a small footnote in the history books. No movies, no television shows. Just a man who followed a paper trail to its logical conclusion and changed American law enforcement forever. Every financial forensics case, every asset forfeiture, and every federal prosecution of a mob boss over the last 90 years owes a direct debt to the strategy Wilson pioneered. The Untouchables sold you a cinematic fantasy that America defeats its worst monsters with courage and gunfire. But that is not how it works. A man like Capone can survive bullets. He can buy judges. He can silence witnesses. But what he cannot do is unmake the paper trail left behind by $100 million in cash. In the end, a modestly paid federal employee sat in a cramped office, read the receipts, and sent the undisputed emperor of Chicago to die on a rock. Al Capone made an entire city afraid to even whisper his name. But the men who finally broke him never raised their voices. They just kept counting. And in America, the ledger always wins. If this story pulled you in, hit subscribe right now. We drop a new, hard-hitting mob documentary every single week. Tell me down in the comments, who was more dangerous, the operatic gangster Hollywood gave you, or the cold, corporate kingpin the accountants actually caught?